The highest praise that can be given to an author is to say that his work awakens unexpected possibilities of thought and feeling. Timothy O'Reilly, from his book Frank Herbert, the maker of Dune, Insights of a Master of Science Fiction.
A question for you, gentle viewer. When is a video essay not a video essay? I'll tell you, when you somehow manage to fail at self-sabotage. So here's the situation. Like any self-respecting nerd should, I decided to reread Dune in preparation for the new film that came out in 2021. And boy, did it make my heart sing and give me opinions. Strong opinions. So much so that I just had to write them all down, honestly believing that I'd probably never finish, or if I did, it'd be total shit. But then when I was done, I went over it again and thought, you know what? I've read and watched dozens of Dune reviews, and none of them mention the stuff I talk about here. I guess this is why people put their stuff up on YouTube. I'm gonna do that. And so here we are. Now, to be fair, the second and third parts are better than the first, so if you want to skip to this point in the video, I won't hold it against you. Either way, buckle up, snort some spice, and join me as we go over 3 lessons we can learn from the golden standard of epic science fiction, Frank Herbert's Dune.
Science fiction and fantasy are similarly fascinating in that they both transport us to worlds filled with wonders we've never seen before, because, as A.C. Clarke expressed perfectly in his third law, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. But the big difference between them is that science fiction should be based on exactly the same rules and laws that apply in our world, hence the science part. This is what I like most about the genre, because it means that there is actually a chance, no matter how tiny, that the amazing things one reads about in the book could conceivably become real at some point. It's the same reason why everyone finds dinosaurs so fascinating, because we know that they actually existed. In my particular case, Dune holds a special place in my heart because it was the book that taught me that making a story world believable is the author's responsibility. This was the first epic scope fiction book I encountered which took the trouble of providing explanations to help me become immersed in the story, instead of just dropping that hard job on my lap. Over the course of Dune, my concept of science fiction went from kitschy and campy Flash Gordon spandex types, pretty much the Lone Ranger bad in space, to more of a Lord of the Ring-ish situation. Here was an entire world, in this case a universe, which you could really get immersed into because it was so well thought out that it was consistent, and therefore it was believable. Ever since Dune, my tolerance for poor world building has been increasingly dropping, because whenever a book seems ridiculous or inconsistent, I realize it means that the author has been careless or lazy, and that if they didn't take their work seriously, then why should I? In contrast, Dune goes into great detail about the entire setting, its history and organization, to explain why things are the way they are. Creating this canon takes a lot of thankless work by an author, like coming up with a backstory, languages, cultures, traditions, songs, etc., that you often don't even read about directly in the book. In Dune's case, a lot of it was put in the appendixes, but it also results in a world that is much more believable, because some of that canon does seep through, like in the way the characters behave and how the narrative is tightly knit. Those little details are the magic source that allows a reader to become immersed in a world, instead of being constantly pulled out of enjoying the story by sudden jolts of unsuspendable disbelief. This is even more impressive when you are seeking to create reasonable explanations for innovative and far-reaching concepts like the Bene Gesserit, Mentats, a galactic corporation run as a feudal empire, protective shields that stop laser weapons and thus force hand-to-hand combat, etc. For instance, one tiny element in the book, just a throwaway line, 600 plus pages, that most Dune reviews never touch on, but fans obsess about, is that Herbert took the time to come up with the Butlerian Jihad to explain why there were no supercomputers or super robots in his universe. He even bothered to come up with a name for it, because of course societies always name important wars and other significant events. See, that's what I mean about the small details that bring a story alive. But more on naming later. Bear in mind that this was in the early 60s, a long time before anyone other than a handful of hard science fiction authors like Asimov in stories like Reason and Clarke in 2001 even had the notion of AI in their heads, whereas now it's basically the first issue to address when contemplating the future. In addition, the Butlerian Jihad also created a very elegant explanation for why humans opted for developing their own potential in the form of the Bene Gesserit, Mentats and all that, instead of relying increasingly on machines.
Once men turned their thinking over to machines, in the hope that this would set them free, but that only permitted other men with machines to enslave them. "Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a man's mind," Paul quoted. "The Great Revolt took away a crutch," she said. "It forced human minds to develop. Schools were started to train human talents."
The interesting thing is that many of the works that were clearly influenced by Dune, looking at you, Star Wars, also adapted those core elements. But then they didn't bother to include any explanations for them, so they ended up coming across as ridiculous instead of amazing. Two quick examples from Star Wars. First, since we already mentioned the Butlerian Jihad, yes, it's the future and there are super advanced androids that can hack into any mainframe or speak millions of languages, but that's all the impact they have on society. Everything else is basically 1970s Earth. And forget Boston Dynamics, they're either a Roomba or move like a breakdancer pretending to be a robot. Second, since we already mentioned using blades, yes, it's the future and there are laser guns, but the moronic Jedi Knights prefer to use hand-to-hand weapons because they are
an elegant weapon for a more civilized age.
Whatever the fuck that's supposed to mean. Personally, my favorite moment in the entire prequel trilogy was the scene in the arena when sanity was restored as the Jedi morons were mowed down by regular morons with guns. I mean, come on, bringing a knife to a gunfight is literally a cliche for stupidity. And now we're going to take a short break from beating on Star Wars. No, we're not quite done yet, but we'll carry on in the next section. Another very important element which Herbert didn't apply in a lazy way is the common trope of the chosen one. Paul is not only the end result of 90 generations of a genetic breeding program designed to produce the Kwisatz Haderach, and thus already well on his way to awesomeness from the moment of his birth. And if you're wondering how many years that would take, I calculated it because I'm a geek, it's about 2500. But on top of that, he's coached all his life by the best experts in the universe. He's got leadership from Leto, combat and military training from Gurney and Duncan, Mentat instruction from Thufir, Bene Gesserit control over himself and others from Jessica, and whatever else you might have added to that. Backstabbing, ruthlessness, I don't know. So of course he's the special one. He better bloody well be the special one, because you literally couldn't find a more special individual in the entire universe. And as if that weren't enough, his abilities are then enhanced by melange, and all of that allows him to become the first male to survive the water of life and reach the final level of Super Saiyan badassery. You're so fucking special. It's not surprising he becomes a superhero. It would be like making a Captain America test tube baby, then training him like the Black Widow, and then topping it all off with gamma rays to turn him into the Hulk. Again, badass. Now, like we saw with the previous examples, compare Herbert's approach of taking the trouble to craft a realistic superhero with what we generally see in media nowadays. All of this background is completely missing from current chosen ones. Instead, most modern stories, ironically many of them as a result of Dune's influence, you can be sure of that, feature unrealistically young protagonists becoming heroes or even superheroes while completely neglecting to give a coherent reason for it. Or just any reason.
Who was his father?
There was no father.
But come on, look at any teenager. It's by far the least likely stage of life for someone to be a hero. And yet we're expected to accept that those characters magically happen to be freaks of nature who are not completely self-absorbed, hormone-drunk kids. Instead, they are mature enough and with a sufficiently strong moral compass to wield great power responsibly. It's so ridiculous that of course disbelief refuses to be meekly suspended. Instead, it grabs you by the collar and shouts in your face, "This is completely absurd! Nothing in his entire life has prepared that teenager to deal with any form of extreme situation, other than being the protagonist of a novel, that is. To make it worse, more often than not, they are accompanied by, or defeat, supporting characters who have trained all their lives to become the right person for the job. But when the moment of truth arrives, they can't do it for some absurd reason, like a lack of midi-what-the-fucklorians.
Midichlorians are a microscopic life form that resides within all living cells.
Or a scar with the right shape in the right place, or for no reason at all, like the cretins in Hunger Games and Ready Player One. Hey, look, this otherwise completely unremarkable teenager can shoot a bow, has memorized Wikipedia. Who better to lead a revolution and overthrow the entire world's social structure? It's completely absurd. And so naturally, the moment you look at these supposed heroes, you see that the only special thing about them is being the special one. Damn right they're the chosen one, chosen by the author. But then again, I suppose that's exactly what makes these characters attractive to younger readers. It feeds them the delusion that anyone can just become the most very specialist person in the world ever and change the entire society, since apparently the only requirement is a little bit of luck.
Or what the hell, not even luck, just do like this guy.
My name is Neo.
And pick yourself a nickname that literally says that you are the one.
And now that we're talking about names with meanings, we must mention that Herbert also took the trouble to find great names. And that leads us to the next thing that is outstanding about Dune. If you've ever played Dungeons & Dragons, or any role-playing game really, you will be familiar with the concept of a character sheet. Each player gets one of these to give them a general idea of their character's strengths and weaknesses by providing scores for different attributes. In fact, many fiction authors use similar character sheets when populating their works, as this helps them to flesh out individuals and also to keep them consistent throughout the story. But this is a meta concept that can also be applied to the authors themselves. You see, writing doesn't take just one skill, but a whole stack of them, like creating settings, action, characters, dialogue, pacing, descriptions, and a very long etc. Each author has a different score for each skill, and their particular combination is what produces their unique style. One specific talent in the creativity domain is naming. Perhaps a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, but it wouldn't sound as lovely, because regardless of what the bard said, we all know that a name is extremely powerful. So much so that the power of a real name over its bearer is a recurring trope in fiction, used in The Neverending Story, Harry Potter, Death Note, The Belgariad, The Chronicles of Prydain, and that's just off the top of my head. In fact, the power of names doesn't only apply inside stories, but around them too. In another meta twist, plenty of writers have sought to safeguard their real names by taking up pen names. You have Michael Crichton, John Lange, Samuel Langhorne Clements, Mark Twain, Charles Dodson, Lewis Carroll, Stephen King, Richard Bachman, Joanne Rowling, Robert Galbraith, and nobody knows the real name of Elena Ferrante. And this isn't exclusive to writers. We see the same in all other forms of art. Actors, painters, musicians, and of course, every single rapper ever. Even fictional ones.
What's the matter, dog? You in Paris? This guy's a gangster? His real name's Clarence. And Clarence lives at home with both parents. And Clarence's parents have a real good marriage.
But the power of names isn't just limited to people. It affects everything with a name. And that's why this talent becomes even more important in fiction works. When an author is building an entire new reality, like in science fiction and fantasy, the audience wants to understand how the world works. The more different it is from ours, the harder it will be for readers to get their bearings and figure out who, what, and where everything is. This is where a naming talent can weave wonders, because sometimes world building can be as simple and elegant as word building. You see what I did there? For example, the author can save himself a lot of work and keep the narrative flowing smoothly by coming up with a name that allows us to skip lengthy explanations, because it instantly tells us everything we really need to know. This could take the form of making up a new term or portmanteau, like Herbert did in Dune with hunter-seeker, pain amplifier, still suit, lasgun, ornithopter, or axolotl tank. Other times it may be using or adapting real foreign languages with the right associations, such as the numerous Arabic terms in Dune, which are ideal for the Fremen because they are naturally associated with a desert-dwelling culture, like Shai Hulud, Eternal Thing, Fedaykin, Fedayin are guerrilla warriors, and Muad'Dib is a teacher or tutor. And Herbert also borrowed Arrakis from the Arabic name of the real star Mu Draconis A. Dune also includes terms from Navajo, Latin, Chakobsa, Nahuatl, Greek, Persian, East Indian, Russian, Turkish, Finnish, and Old English. And then of course, if the author can't find the perfect portmanteau or foreign term, he can always just make one up. This is perhaps the best expression of a naming talent, and it is often the main thing that people remember from a book, because a good name will convey plenty of information all by itself. Sometimes it's simply a question of its sound evoking subconscious associations. Think about it. You don't need to read a single page of The Lord of the Rings to instinctively just know that nothing good is ever going to happen to you in Mordor. I consider Herbert a fantastic namer, and what I really like about his particular style is that he wasn't attached to any specific formula, and instead just used whatever was best suited to the purpose at hand. We already mentioned how he adapted many terms to serve the narrative, but also the ones that he made up from scratch are mostly pretty good, like Baliset, Semuta, Corrino or Shadout, and sometimes excellent, like Feydраutha, Sardaukar, Mentat, Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohiam, and Princess Irulan, even though the last one is an anagram of urinal, and now that you heard it, you won't be able to stop yourself laughing every time you hear it. Furthermore, there is undeniable talent, even genius I'd say, in being able to synergize two previously existing words into something new that sounds infinitely better than either of them separately. With the ultimate example being Duncan Idaho, who is obviously a cool, tough cowboy type, and I'd bet the Ark of the Covenant that he was the inspiration for the name Indiana Jones. Incidentally, this is why I disliked how he was cast in David Lynch's Dune, because I was expecting to see someone who embodied that name as well as Indiana Jones did, and instead we got a smoothly combed, clean-shaven, happily smiling guy right out of a Ralph Lauren ad. He was just missing a sweater over the shoulders and loafers with no socks. But let's not get sidetracked tearing into David Lynch's shit show right now. I've already dedicated a whole essay to that. As we've already established, Herbert wasn't lazy and instead took the time to do a lot of research and try different approaches until he got things just right. And we can see this very clearly in many of the names that he picked. We don't need to know anything about their background to appreciate them, because they simply sound fantastic by themselves and their meaning is not essential to the story. But if we take the trouble to geek out on them, and we always have time for that, they add another layer. For example, Bene Gesserit in Latin means it will have been well done, managed or carried out. And Kwisatz Haderach comes from the Hebrew Kefitzat Haderek, probably murdered that, which means shortening of the way or leap forward, which is exactly what Paul is in a genetic breeding program. But let me give you the best possible example, and hopefully you'll share the delight that I felt when I found out about it. Herbert chose the name Atreides for his main character, and that name is so freaking cool that it becomes an instant classic from the moment you first read it. The atr just feels amazing as it rolls off the tongue and then seamlessly blends with the ever so smooth des. That feels like it should be prolonged until you run out of breath. But Herbert didn't pick it just because it sounded cool. He was actually searching for a name that would give the house a sense of monumental aristocracy but with tragedy hanging over them. And Atreides is the family name of Agamemnon from the Iliad, who definitely fits the bill. But wait, that's not all. Atreides comes from Agamemnon's father, King Atreus of Mycena in ancient Greece. Mycenaean culture often sacrificed bulls to the gods, as their blood was thought to regenerate the dead. Well, in the book we read several times about how Duke Leto's father was killed by a bull, whose head hangs in the family's great hall with the old duke's blood stains still visible on its horns. But wait, it gets even better. House Atreides has a long-standing rivalry with House Harkonnen. Once again, that's a fantastic name. Just as in the case of Mordor, you don't need to have read Dune to simply know that Baron Vladimir Harkonnen is scary and does bad things to people. And once again, that name wasn't just picked because it sounds great. That family name is an adaptation of the Finnish surname Harkonnen, which in turn is derived from Harka, the Finnish word for bull. Man, I just love that he went through all the trouble of coming up with A, fantastic names, which B, had a deeper meaning to them, and then he didn't even bother to make it explicit in the book. And in case you're thinking that Herbert didn't put all that work into this, that it's all just a coincidence and I'm reading too deeply into it, then think again. Because although he may not have said it explicitly, he did leave a clue. Nowadays we'd call it an Easter egg.
Double meaning. Double meaning. The Baron thought. He looked up at the new talismans flanking the exit to his hall, the mounted bull's head and the oil painting of the old Duke Atreides, the late Duke Leto's father.
In fact, we could go even deeper by looking into their titles, since Duke comes from dux, the Latin word for leader, while Baron comes from baro, the Latin word for mercenary, but that really might be pushing it a bit. Regardless, the use of ancient honorific titles is another decision that worked really well, even though this universe is many galaxies and millennia away from Earth, and the reason why is because those titles add a gravitas that something like Vice President of Choam Corporation simply wouldn't, while simultaneously justifying why leadership is inherited and thus why Paul would be trained from birth to become a deserving heir. All in all, there were very few names or combinations in Dune that I didn't like, either for their sound or for not fitting with what they refer to, like Weirdingway, Thumper, Jamis, the Wellington before Yue, the Gurney before Halleck, and all of Thufir Hawat. And since we've started talking about things that I don't really like about the book, this seems like a perfect place to end this essay and move on to the next one, where we'll delve into all the aspects of Dune that are not so wonderful.